Greetings, family. Tino Blaine King here, the pioneer of Black pragmatism. Really quick, before we start the show today, I wanted to take a second to give a shout out to a Black-owned, operated business right here in Harvey, Louisiana, Woodmere to be exact. The name of the business is Fleur de Kim. They are a unique t-shirt and apparel shop. I hope you guys can see the shirt that I'm wearing. I can't see what you can see. I guess when we actually post this video, I'll know if you were able to see it or not. But please give them a shout out if you're in the area. If not, you can get them online. They're also on Facebook at Fleur de Kim, I believe is their page. The address is 2066 Woodmere Boulevard, and that's Harvey, Louisiana, 70058. Phone number 504-210-6743. And again, that's on Facebook at Fleur de Kim. Hopefully you guys can find something that they have to offer, like this wonderful shirt that they made for me. All right, let's get this show started. Uhuru na Nguvu.
No. You looking at a free black man.
Talk Black 360.
You want to know what a free black man look like? Look at me.
Uhuru na Nguvu. Welcome to another dose of Talk Black 360. I am your host, Tino Blaine King, the Kool-Aid and Kush, the pioneer of Black pragmatism. I've got a great show lined up for you today. Today's topic is, does black voting matter? I've had a lot of things to happen in the past couple weeks since we are in election season here in Louisiana. There's probably still a few runoffs going on, but there was some conversation that I've had, and I definitely wanted to put together a podcast to share some of this important information with you guys about voting from my perspective in some historical context. Just kind of take it in, process it, and then do with it what you like. All right, so let's talk about those posts that I put up. I'm going to read a couple of them to you. One of them said, on October 3rd, I put up, a politician could have 85% of his voters be black and will still say they are a politician for all people, not just blacks. I thought that was a very disingenuous statement. Personal experience. If you've got such a large constituency of black people, why do you need to say that you're not a politician for blacks? But nonetheless, let's keep going. The other post that I put up, sorry, no more coded language. Tell me exactly what you plan to do for black people or you don't get a black vote, period. And I think this just speaks to doing away with the wink and the nod. I don't think that we can no longer take for granted that if you are a voter, that the politicians have black interests at heart. We have to demand that they speak to black interests if you're going to exercise your right to vote. And if they want your vote, then they definitely ought to be talking to you about what they're going to do for you. Another one that I put up was, how much knowledge or intelligence is needed to cast a vote? And I know this seems like it might be a dig at voters. It's not. The context in which I made that post was this. You're talking about one of the most powerful countries in the world. And we are living in not only one of the most powerful countries in the world, we're living in a very complex society. Locally, nationally, globally. A very, very complex society. And I just want to adjust our thought process to understand that if we're of the mindset that the powers that be in this country, or even anywhere else for that matter, is going to leave its future and its destiny in the hands of uninformed citizens. And when I say uninformed citizens, I don't mean that in a negative manner. I mean, we live in a complex society. So there's a lot of information that you just can't and won't get because of the everyday process of survival. That goes for whites, blacks, Spanish, whomever has a vote. It's just a reality that that's not the way that it works or even that it should work. So that post was to just put that in context. The things that matter to us most in our struggle, we never really voted on. The things that had the most impact, we never really voted on. So I think that helps us to put the right to vote in a better context. So I don't ever want us to believe that our ancestors were not always engaged in the freedom fight, in the fight for not just equality, but the fight for Black independence and the ability for Black people to be the navigators of their own future. So I don't think it is in any way disrespectful to our ancestors not to vote. But before I get into this part of why I particularly don't vote now and explaining why the voting process, or at least the vote, isn't as important as we might think it is, I want to just touch upon some history of the vote. Let's start with George Washington, 1789. Very important, first president of the United States. Important because what we need to look at then is how we're establishing what this whole concept of voting is about. Or we're going to establish what it set out to do and what was its infancy. So George Washington was elected by 100% of the voters. And it's important to make that point because there was only about 6% of the people who actually voted. The only people who were allowed to vote was rich white landowners. So you got a group of wealthy white landowners who are deciding the direction that they want to take this country in. And I want to be clear that that is, in fact, the roots of this nation. And I think we would be fooling ourselves to think that that group wanted anything specifically for Black people. That group was concerned with its own interests. And I think that's a fair statement to make. But from that group, remember, you've got a growing nation, a growing group of colonies that are ambitious. And in order to fulfill those ambitions, they do have to bring in support and other minds and other energies. Keeping in mind, there's already the use or abuse of the slaves, and they're benefiting and profiting from that reality. But now you've got other immigrant groups and other groups of the colonialists that are actually vying for power. And what you end up with is two groups of white wealth fighting to secure their position for this group of colonies, as well as for their position on the global stage. But even then, you've got this wealthy group of white people who are trying to make decisions without having the population of Black people have too much impact. All of these things ultimately gives the original interests of this country 100+ years to establish foundation before Black voters are allowed into the game. On that backdrop, I want to start to explain to you why the Black vote and in the manner of which we're executing the Black vote just doesn't really matter all that much. But let's take a look And then, like I said, you take the information, you decide. Let's go.
After all, the United States prides itself on being a democracy, or a government in which the ultimate authority lies with the citizens of the nation. But it was not always this way. In 1789, George Washington won the Electoral College with 100% of the vote. But whose vote was it? Probably not yours. Only 6% of the entire United States population was allowed to vote at all. Voting was a right that only white male property owners were allowed to exercise. By the 1820s and 1830s, the American population was booming from the East Coast into the western frontier. Frontier farmers were resilient, self-reliant, and mostly ineligible to vote because they did not own land. As these new areas of the nation became states, they typically left out the property requirement for voting. Leaders such as Andrew Jackson, the United States' first common man president, promoted what he called universal suffrage. Of course, by universal suffrage, Jackson really meant universal white male suffrage. All he emphasized was getting rid of the property requirement for voting, not expanding the vote beyond white men.
All right. So I'm not going to hold you up on this. I'm going to try to walk you through this as fast as we can, but we've got to get some perspective on, why this vote is not as important as we think it is, even at the local level. But at the end, remember, we're going to come back, we're going to assess the situation, and we're going to draw a conclusion that could help us to move forward. But right now, I want you to take a look at one of the elders, Reverend Wright, see what he had to say.
For 13 colonies before they became states in 1787, to show that from the 1630s to 1787, every law that appeared on the books of the colonies as it pertained to race had nothing to do with jurisprudence, nothing to do with legal precedents, nothing to even do with English common law. It had to do with custom, whatever the custom was. So for 150 years, you had racism sewn into the legal fabric of 13 colonies. How could you help but have a racist document in 1787 when the Constitution is put together after 150 years of racism in all the colonies' legal structure?
All right. So now we're bringing up one of the very important components of the minimizing the value of the vote. And as Reverend Wright mentioned, the Constitution, because remember, we started with Washington, but before Washington, we had all of these years of racism that was the culture of the country. So remember, I said the interests that this country was designed to protect and to further was that of rich white men. And throughout the history of this country, you've had, although we've gotten the opportunity to vote, we've gotten the right to vote, you still had a concerted effort of the descendants of the original interests of this country still attempting to put forward its platform. And I think we make a very, very large mistake when we just give up our interest for the larger interest of the country. We should see it from this perspective. If our interests are met, as a byproduct, the country becomes a stronger place. But let's look at how the things that are put in place aren't even being considered as one of the factors of the minimizing the black vote. Take a look.
From 1788 until 1937, the U.S. basically lived under a regime of dual federalism, which meant government power was strictly divided between the state and national governments. Notice I didn't say separated because I don't want you to confuse federalism with separation of powers. Don't do it! With dual federalism, there are some things that only the federal government does and some things that only the state governments do. This is sometimes called jurisdiction. The national government had jurisdiction over internal improvements like interstate roads and canals, subsidies to the states, and tariffs, which are taxes on imports and thus fall under the general heading of foreign policy. The national government also owns public lands and regulates patents, which need to be national for them to offer protection for inventors in all the states. And because you want a silver dollar in Delaware to be worth the same as a silver dollar in Georgia, the national government also controls currency. The state government had control over property laws, inheritance laws, commercial laws, banking laws, corporate laws, insurance, family law, which means marriage and divorce, morality, stuff like public lewdness and drinking, keeps me in check, public health, education, criminal laws, including determining what is a crime and how crimes are prosecuted, prosecuted, land use, which includes water and mineral rights, elections, local government, and licensing of professions and occupations.
Okay. Let's stop right there, because what you're looking at now is the process in which these special interests, these founding members or founding citizens, or still, remember, like we talked about, they're jockeying for power and position. And while we're fighting for a promise that has never been intended to be kept, all the while they're pillaging the concept of America and taking what they feel is rightfully theirs and moving forward. So what you're getting now is a developmental concept that you need to understand so that you can realize what you're looking at as far as your vote is concerned. So remember, you've got the Constitution in place that was built on the frame of racism, and then you've got a special interest group of white men still trying to maintain power of this country that they've created. And there's actual political practices that are taking place during the time that we're worrying about being able to vote. So as that process is taking place, federalism is taking a hold, and it's starting to make the vote of the individual much less important. Not to even mention the consideration of the state much less important. But let's go ahead and look at the next clip.
Now, some of you might be wondering, Craig, where does the national government get the power to do anything that has to do with states? Yeah, well, off the top of my head, the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is what's known as the Commerce Clause, and the way that it's been interpreted forms the basis of dual federalism and cooperative federalism. For most of the 19th century, the Supreme Court decided that almost any attempt by any government, federal or state, to regulate state economic activity would violate the Commerce Clause. This basically meant that there was very little regulation of business at all. Freedom! And this is how things stood, with the U.S. following a system of dual federalism with very little government regulation, and the national government not doing much other than going to war, buying or conquering enormous amounts of territory, and delivering the mail. Then the Great Depression happened, and Franklin Roosevelt and Congress enacted the New Deal, which changed the role of the federal government in a big way. The New Deal brought us cooperative federalism, where the national government encourages states and localities to pursue nationally defined goals. The main way that the federal government does this is through dollar bills, y'all.
All right. So now you're getting it. You see, what's happening, what's actually taking place is the promise of America is being siphoned off to all of those people, including other races that were not a part of this foundation of America, not a part of America's original interest, including all of those folks, are being siphoned off what is called the promise of America, while in the background, the main core root and foundational Americans and their descendants are negotiating their power, not only in America, but on the global stage. And as you can see in this process, they're using federalism to do it. And federalism is, in fact, perpetuating a stronger power of the Constitution. Let's keep going.
This money that the federal government gives to the state is called a grant and aid. Grants and aid can work like a carrot, encouraging a state to adopt a certain policy, or work like a stick when the federal government withholds funds if a state doesn't do what the national government wants. Grants and aid are usually called categorical because they're given to states for a particular purpose, like transportation or education or alleviating poverty.
Okay, all right. So now you're starting to get the idea. It's about the money. It's about the Constitution. Just like Rothschild said, if you give me control of a nation's money supply, I care not who makes the laws. So if that's the case, then now what you have coming about is a country that is promising something, but at the same time building something that is in the interest of the people who founded the country and their descendants. And we're still talking about a value of a vote. All right, let's go forward.
The basic type of cooperative federalism is the carrot-stick type, which is sometimes called marble cake federalism because it mixes up the state and federal governments in ways that makes it impossible to separate the two. The key to this is, you guessed it, dollar bills, y'all, money. But there's another aspect of cooperative federalism that's really not so cooperative, and that's regulated federalism. Under regulated federalism, the national government sets up regulations and rules that the states must follow. Some examples of these rules, also called mandates, are EPA regulations, civil rights standards, and the rules set up by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Sometimes the government gives the states money to implement the rules, but sometimes it doesn't, and they must comply anyway. That's called an unfunded mandate. A good example of this is OSHA regulations that employers have to follow. States don't like these, and Congress tried to do something about them with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, or UMRA, but it hasn't really worked. In the early 21st century, Americans are basically living under a system of cooperative federalism with some areas of activity that are heavily regulated. This is a stretch from the original idea that federalism will keep the national government small and have most government functions belong to the states.
Yep. Okay, so as you see, the new tactics are not as overt. You've got federalism, which is beginning to detract from the power of the states. So this is going to go right in the face of the argument of, yeah, the national vote might not be that important, but maybe the local vote is. But I'm not finished. We're going to go further because that's not actually a good theory either. Let's take a look at two things. First, we're going to look at the Electoral College just to get a general principle of what that's all about. Of course, another way to take away the power of the vote at the federal level. But we'll also see how the federal decisions are now about to weigh heavily on the local execution of law. Because in order for local governments to operate, they have the need for federal monies. And now the need for federal money is also being furthered with federal mandates. And the state governments are having to comply.
Here's how the Electoral College works. The presidential election happens in two phases. The first phase is purely democratic. We hold 51 popular elections every presidential election year, one in each state and one in D.C. On Election Day in 2012, you may have thought you were voting for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney, but you were really voting for a slate of presidential electors. In Rhode Island, for example, if you voted for Barack Obama, you voted for the state's 4 Democratic electors. If you voted for Mitt Romney, you were really voting for the state's 4 Republican electors. Part 2 of the election is held in December, and it is this December election among the state's 538 electors, not the November election, which officially determines the identity of the next president. At least 270 votes are needed to win.
Okay, so there you saw the establishment of the Electoral College, further diminishing the value of the state vote. Of course, the Electoral College, like they said, was designed to bring together the states, because you don't actually vote for the president. You're voting for the people who are going to vote for the president, if that makes any sense. But we think the vote is important. But let's look at how they're further siphoning things away, because remember, the government monies are coming out of the government coffers, but they're a mechanism of control over the states. The states' budgets have to balance, whereas the federal government's budget doesn't, because of this phenomena that they introduced. Take a look.
The gold reserves of the U.S. were getting depleted quickly, so President Nixon stopped allowing that. He took the United States, and thereby the world, off anything even resembling a gold standard in 1971. At this point, the money we use isn't backed by anything tangible. Fiat currencies, as they're called, are basically backed by confidence. The dollar is backed by the confidence people have in the U.S., the British pound by people's confidence in the U.K., and so on. The value of one currency compared to another therefore fluctuates continuously. Confidence-driven supply and demand, if you will.
All right. I hope you're getting this. We're worrying about voting, but in fact, like we talked about earlier, the decisions, the big, tough decisions are made by the federal government. Federal government supersedes local government. And when we understand that, we'll realize that our input is much, much less valuable. We'll get to a solution later, but let's just keep this in mind. The intent of the federal government is to use the racist Constitution to take away the powers of the state at every level, to take away the power of your local governments at every level. So when you're voting, you're putting someone in office to represent a position or to take a position that is to serve the interests of the original founders, if you will, of this country and their descendants. You think that you're moving your way towards equality, but that's not a reality, because now that there is no measure of monies and then you're controlled by those monies, there's no longer the ability for the local governments to influence the federal government. So this voting that we're doing is becoming less and less important as time goes on. There is some hope, but for right now, unless we have organization, unless we have our own agenda, we can keep voting for things that just is not going to be impactful on the foundation that is working against us. So let's take a look at what's happening when we put our elected officials in office. Let's start all the way at the top. Here's somebody that I know you guys like. Let's see what happened when he came into office.
Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice.
Yep, there you go. So you've elected the president. The president works for the Constitution. The Constitution works against you. Let's keep going, because that's only the president. Who else is involved in this sham?
Will you all please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that you will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that you take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which you are about to enter, so help you God. Congratulations.
So there you go. You see the swearing in Congress, same situation, swearing into a Constitution, to uphold the Constitution. People elected them. They uphold the Constitution. Constitution people not necessarily connected. You have separate interests, and I'm saying we need to start protecting our own. But let's take it down one step further. What about the local government? I'm in Louisiana, so I thought it would be fitting if I gave you something that was based in Louisiana. So take a look. This is Bobby Jindal. Who's he swearing to?
and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all of the duties incumbent upon me
All right. So that's Bobby Jindal. What about? Wait, okay. So what about the law? What representation do we have when it comes to the law, right? To carry out the law. What happens when the Constitution and the law conflict? Well, let's take a look at a group of us that we like to say we put in office to work for us, but they don't work for us. His situation, I think, was in Texas, where there was 17 African-American female judges. Take a look.
Preserve, protect, and defend. The Constitution and laws of the United States. Preserve, protect, and defend. The Constitution and laws of the United States. Preserve, protect, and defend. The Constitution and laws of the United States.
Okay, are you getting the picture? All right. So I think we've got as much of this information out as we're going to be able to get. And in summary, what we're looking at is a group of white men and their descendants who have organized America in such a way that it serves their needs. We've also seen that as individuals, especially as Black people, we give our vote to politicians, and then politicians in return swears an oath to a government that is organized to service the power struggle of rich white men. And we also see that the powers that be are now trying to consolidate their power base inside of the federal government, totally negating the independent sovereignty of the states through the use of grants and federal funds. And then lastly, you have this move towards globalism, where now the descendants of this initial group and their descendants, are now negotiating for power on the world stage. And we are trying to figure out whether or not our vote matters in a path to try to attain equality. And then later the conversation starts where we think what will bring us closer to equality is reparations. In my conclusion, I don't think it's any doubt that the vote, if at all effective, is minimized. But to not be completely cynical, I want to shed some light on the situation and provide this solution. We can begin to focus on us, because we cannot be deceived to think that these things as they are not going to get worse. If we begin to focus on us, then we can protect us. And if we protect us, then we are better able to be a universal people and a accommodating neighbor to all other races. The other thing that we could do is not elect officials in a political race. If we organize, we could begin to select our own officials that go into this government system representing us. But in order to do that, we must organize these embassies, and inside of these embassies, we must draft our local black agendas, our state black agendas, and our federal black agendas. And I even have a plan that we must discuss inside of our embassies that will help us to navigate and to develop our global black agenda. So this seems like a great task. What I'm going to tell you is it can be done. The details of this has to be discussed inside of our embassies, where we take care of our own needs and educate our own on how to take care of our needs. But it's not such a great task that it can't be accomplished if we begin to work on it. Find 2 or 3 like-minded people, start working, connect with myself, other like-minded individuals, and let's get this process started. Until then, stay strong and stay black. Ashe? This has been another dose of Talk Black 360.
No, no, no. You will never be enslaved again by no man.